we can start the second panel entitled Cultural Encounters. In this panel, we will have three presenters. First, Dr. Shah Mahmoud Hanafi from James Madison University, Zuzanna Boyet from Jagiellonian University, and Dr. Azad Haji Aga from Jagiellonian University. Welcome, everyone. Please, dear Shah Mahmoud Hanafi, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Joanna, for that introduction. Thank you, Carolina, for your, am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, and also ASPS and Joanna, thank you for organizing this. It's a real pleasure to be here. Matthias, thank you in advance for shifting the screen for me, okay? But my concern here is with translation. And when we think of translation, we think of interpretation, mediation, kind of information provisioning, all filtered through a variety of institutions and power structures, including universities, in the military, publishing houses and presses also affect the concerns of translation. When I think of Afghanistan as really the geographic kind of core of the Persianate world, it strikes me how much of a zone of translation it has been. Not just a zone of kind of transition or transformation, but also really, if we think of historic Afghanistan, not with borders, but the space between the Indus, Amu Darya, Hindu Kush, as a zone of translation. I found that kind of a provocative food for thought as we get going. When I think, I must invoke kind of the longer term history here, and just very briefly thinking through the history of Alexander's presence, the translation issues involved in that. Ashoka, Al-Biruni, Babur, coming through that extensive, multi-millennia period, translation is a big part of the historical changes that we're considering. Getting to the processes leading to the modern Afghan state, it's really important to think of translations and interaction between Persian and Pashto, between the cities of Kandahar and Kabul, and really through the 18th, the 18th century beginning of the Afghan kind of polity, the 19th century colonial period with English and Russian now and other languages, Urdu, really impacting the translation scene in Afghanistan before the 20th century and the American imperial presence. And I do think of the United States as an empire. I think it's useful to think that way about the global projections, in particular regarding Afghanistan specifically. So the concerns for translation in this context are English, Pashto, and Persian. And Pashto is kind of the weak link in that triangulation in structural terms. The United States presence really begins with kind of soft power. Let's just, if we could turn the screen, Matthias, please. The United States presence in the Cold War really involves, again, the soft power of development. And we see the Kabul Times being a primary translation artifact, of translating into English the official Persian news of Bakhtar News Agency, but bringing in translations of other global languages into English for the Kabul emergent public sphere. Hafizullah Amin, some of you may know for his political career, but he also has a career as a translator for the American Embassy in Kabul, 1962 to 63. Hafizullah Amin and Nur Muhammad Taraki kind of bring Pashto into the field of politics in ways not previously reckoned with, and this does involve translation of things like Nur Muhammad's biography from Pashto to Persian and things like the dynamics really, if we can Just move to the next slide, please, Mateus, because we get into the now 1980s, when the Soviet invasion and the American response generates a lot of translation issues. Translation now involving Russian and English and Urdu and Arabic, but there are some key kind of actors in this larger field of translation and geopolitics. Louis Dupree, a public kind of academic anthropologist, has another career that's less well known, but it involves kind of coordination, various intelligence work. I don't know precisely his relationship to the Mujahideen, but his translators, Muhammad Alam on the left, lost his life for sort of translation services for Louis Dupree. And the role of anthropology as a kind of primary discipline for Afghanistan, the role of ethnography as a translation enterprise, a cultural translation enterprise in the first instance, really does draw attention to the anthropologists and their translators in Afghanistan. And the fate of Muhammad Alam is tragic, but there are some kind of success stories of other translators for American anthropologists becoming, in the 1980s and 90s, becoming kind of influential power brokers in their own right. And I'm thinking of Nejat Najumi, I'm thinking of Shah Mahmoud Miakhel, whose translation services really kind of carried them into positions of power. I think the role of Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani, to some lesser extent, Karzai explicitly as a kind of translator during these 80s and 90s, does have something to do with how things played out after 2001, which is really where we need to go. If we can please, Mateus, move the screen forward one. And in 2001, this is known as kind of a smart war. And what we have now is technology becoming a real big kind of mediator in the translation enterprise in Afghanistan involving multiple languages. And this now also gets us into a further and deeper distinction between overt and covert operations and the kinds of translations that filter through networks that become a part of the kill chain and translation networks that kind of go public into academic and public spheres, kind of in translation systems that aren't always in dialogue, a kind of fault line of empire. And, you know, in 2003, there were, and of course, the politics of Pashto and Persian here are kind of significant in the way things play out regarding politics and the conduct of wars, translation enterprises undergirding both. In 2003, it appears there were an organization for the Afghan Translators Society emerges, composed of at least 22 organizations for translation in Kabul, a giant market for translation. The market for translation, both in the public sphere and for governmental contracts, is huge. And it does have a bearing on the quality of translation and the purpose for translation and the effect of translations. In 2004, there appear to be 17,000 translators. And now the real derogatory term TERP appears, Afghan Terps, very clearly major contracts in 2005. The Titan industry has a huge contract, $4.65 billion, and part of which is dedicated to translations. And the problems with these companies, the way this one comes in to become L3, feeds into Dynacore, connected to the Iraq War, the translation industry becomes a part of the imperial presence. And in 2006, we get now the beginning of the human terrain system that lasts till 2014, kind of culture friendly warfare or something like that, where language becomes a big part of the equation, not language as much as culture. So kind of acting on values related to Pashtunwali, for example, becomes standard operating practice. In 2008, of course, Obama's presidency, to get Afghanistan correct, is the surge and the really beginning of the drone war in what becomes the AFPAC program, the AFPAC Hands program, designed really to train about 1,000 military people from 2010 to 2020 in Pashto and the kind of language, but also cultural sensibilities, how to greet and drink tea and things like this that also involve electronic programs. A lot of Rosetta Stone type programs that are digital. And again, the Defense Language Institute by 2008, really, there's also well-known problems with translation. The film, the Guardian film, Lost in Translation by John McHugh, was really kind of famous. It's a short 8-minute film. You can Google it and watch it. The Defense Language Institute morphs into the National Defense Language Institute. And there's a lot of very fast turning institutional change related to languages and translations for Afghanistan. A lot of research and development budgetary cycles affecting how these translation programs, the technologies get instituted. Again, huge numbers. Mission essential personnel gets $1.4 billion for translation. And here we have now problems with vetting translators and the exams to hire translators being corrupted by false exam takers over the phone, lawsuits, and really well-known problems with the translation enterprise. And Obama's Getting Afghanistan Right involved people like General Flynn, who have publications like Fixing Intelligence in Afghanistan. If we can go to the next slide, please. That gets into all kinds of, this is the grave of Faiz Muhammad Khan Khatib Hazara in Chindawal overlooking Kabul. See the blimp in the middle? This beginning in 2008, but really by 2010, the blimps and all around Kabul. If those of you who may remember, next slide, please. Kabul was blanketed with blimps and drones and all kinds of surveillance connection for years. That was Flynn's thing, that you kind of surveil all the digital electronic signals, and then you track terrorists and use drones with signals in this manner. I don't know precisely the mechanics militarily, but it involves a huge amount of translation. And the sort of issue of where this data goes into the closed world of intelligence is quite a serious issue in terms of democratic transparency with tax dollars, as well as the conduct of war. And so the question of war data and the collection of languages for translation and in the context of other biometric data collection, really problematic aspect here. By 2011, there are now kind of competing government-based technologies for translation that are competing with one another across programs. So the human terrain system and its counterinsurgency context, other units of the intelligence world have different programs for translation and language handling, all competing with public private sector like Apple, iPhone translators, really a dynamic field of technologies for translation. Beginning in 2010, 2012, there's a Vox Tech phraselator that projects from English into a target language. So an English command can get broadcast in Pashto or Persian or Urdu or Arabic, beginning in 2012 with a particular company. By 2015, it's just evident that the commercial translation industry is an absolute failure, riddled with kind of poor translations, exam corruption, and a lot of general incompetency in one of the languages involved. And again, the triangulation between Persian, Pashto, and English. If we can go to the last slide, I think I'll finish in a minute. I hope I have a minute. There's a happy story. There are some positive translation stories here. And the main one is Robert McChesney's magnum opus translation of the product of the author whose grave you saw, the Saraj Tawari, really the best official history of Afghanistan, wonderfully available online in English with just user friendliness, a tribute to a lifelong dedication and probably the most significant contribution translation-wise for Afghanistan studies. We most recently see now a translation at the University of Washington, a translation prize for Persian literature involving Afghanistan. And whether or not this includes the Persianate world, and if sort of Pashto language can be included in this, we don't know. But the relationship between Persian and Pashto, the relationship between Persian, Pashto, Arabic, Urdu, English, Russian, French, Japanese, Chinese, all matter for the translation scene in Afghanistan in the contemporary period, and I would argue kind of deeper historical parallels. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shah Mahmoud Hanefi. And now I have pleasure to invite Zuzana Boyet from Hegelian University with her presentation, The Hybrid Aspects of Pamiri Folklore. The floor is yours, Zuzana.
Thank you, Anna. And yeah, good afternoon or good morning, everybody. And thank you for inviting me. I'm logging on my partner's Teams account, so this is why you see me as Kamil. But this is me. And yeah, I'm honored to have a speech today on this conference, and I'm really grateful that I could hear to your presentations as well. And today I'm going to talk to you about the hybridity of Pamiri folklore. And the topic emerged during my research on the representations of animals in Pamiri folklore. And within that project, I sought to establish whether particular representations are persistent in the process of social transmission and consistent with the cultural code. So I wanted to establish the repeatable and systematic, but in the course of my research, I realized that the most important cases were that individual ones, those that represent deviation from the norm. And having already some knowledge of the visions of individual animals, when I came across an unexpected representation, I was amazed at how creative is folklore or folk narrative, and what opportunities it opens for innovations. And today, I'd like to discuss some examples of that invitations that are something that I call hybrid forms. And before I outline very briefly the methodology of my research, I'd like to focus also briefly on what a hybrid is. These definitions come from Webster New Collegiate Dictionary, and according to that definitions, a hybrid is a person produced by the blending of two diverse cultures or traditions. It is also anything of heterogeneous origin or composition, or even more generally, a composite. I also found a linguistic definition, according to which a hybrid is a word composed of elements from different languages. And let me rephrase these definitions so that they apply to the phenomena of folklore. So a hybrid could be, for example, a belief produced by the blending of two diverse cultures. It could be a legend of heterogeneous origin. It could be a character in the legend composed from different cultural codes or different languages. And these definitions point to the coexistence of different cultural codes within folklore, also to cultural exchange, to heterogeneity, to syncretism and dynamism of folklore that could be seen as a process. And what is significant in when we discuss hybridity is that this concept presupposes the existence of the norm, of the pattern beyond which the hybrid goes. So, for example, we know that chimera is a hybrid because we all know how lion, goat, and snake look like. And the chimera is not any of these animals, nor is it the sum of them. Taking a bit from each of that animals, it creates a new quality. And it's in the nature of folklore to constantly go beyond a given abstract pattern and therefore to create hybrids. Just to mention again the famous dichotomy langue and parole. Please forgive me my French accent, I don't know French. But this dichotomy is commonly accepted in folklore studies as in linguistics. And in folklore, langue, language, encompasses the abstract rules and conventions that need to be followed when performing a folklore, while parole refers to performance. So anytime a person performs folklore, for example, tells a tale, that person must follow some rules. But then, so the person has a matrix, but when performing, the person fills this matrix with slightly different content. So no two performances are the same. And this is what I mean when I say that every performance is a hybrid. And briefly about methods of my research. The research material consists mainly of the text of verbal folklore, which are legends, tales, memories, also folk songs, and others. Also, the narratives about the personal experiences with particular animals, narratives about usage of animals in healing or magical practices. And I collected those texts during my field research in the town Khorog, that is the capital of Tajik Badakhshan, that I will show you on the map in a second. So I had two field research trip, and then I also did a short research in Moscow among Pamiri diaspora. And obviously I also used the secondary sources from which I collected texts. And I analyzed the text using semantic categories that enabled me to identify repetitive plot patterns to which I could refer when recognizing hybrids. In the last stage, I tried to contextualize data. So I looked for explanations or possible interpretations of particular representations in close neighborhood, in mythology, in Islam, in everyday experience and practice with animals, etc. So this is the map of Tajik Badakhshan. I know that among listeners, we have also people that are not specialists of Iranian studies. So just for you, I did my research in Khorog among Pamiris that are Iranian ethnic groups that live not only in Tajik Badakhshan, but also in northern Afghanistan, in upper Hunza Valley in Pakistan, and also in Xinjiang in China. And the first hybrid I would like to discuss today is the figure of Shahmor. And this figure occurs in Pamiri tales and legends. And I argue that this figure is a kind of patchwork, a cluster of different motifs of both local and foreign origins. And the name of this figure suggests an affinity with Shahmoran that you can see in the picture. which is a figure mainly known from Kurdish folklore. And Shahmoran itself is a hybrid, is half woman, half snake. And according to one of the best known tale, Shahmoran inhabits a magical land underground and rules over thousands of snakes. She is the guardian of wisdom and medical knowledge. She shares it with those who have shown kindness to her or other snakes from her family. And in Badakhshan, we find very similar tales in which Shahmor is the guardian of knowledge and donor. But in the Pamiri variants, this character is further referred, the name Shahmor always comes with the adjective white. So it's always Shahmor Sefit, the white snake king. And that epithet, white, I consider as that additional component to that figure. And this component is probably of local origin. It is significant as it could imply the positive nature of the snake. In Pamiri folk narratives, white snakes are always positive, while black are generally negative. And this is consistent with local belief that white animals are Muslims and black animals are Kafirs. And in Pamiri folklore, Shahmor Sefit appears not only in tales that are variants of the Kurdish tale, but also in a legend. And it's this legend that I would like to focus on now, because in that legend, Shahmor Sefit plays an even different role to the donor. There are other motives and meanings stitched to the Shahmor in this legend. And the story is that a Pamiri village suffers from drought. One of the residents of this village goes to the Pir Khana in Mumbai to ask for help. And Pir Khana in Mumbai probably refers to the former seat of the Imam, which was indeed located in Mumbai. The journey to Pir Khana is very long and difficult, but the man finally reaches his destination. In the Pir Khana, he receives a snake in a sack. Pir, who has historically in the Ismailism of Badakhshan served as the governor of the Imam and spiritual guide in the community, Pir forbids the man to open the sack before reaching the village. But on the way, the man, out of curiosity or tempted by beautiful woman, opens the sack and the snake immediately jumps out and hides between the rocks. And in the place where the snake hid, a spring water gushes forth. Because what the man didn't know, this snake has the ability to summon water and was given to the man by Pir as a magical agent to save the village. The man failed to bring the snake to the village and save it from drought. Thus, the Shahmor Sefit in this legend is therefore a magical snake with the ability to summon water. It is also most likely a sacred snake, as suggested by the fact that it's kept in Pir Khana. It also acts as a magical agent, but is also a donor itself. It gives water, which is the source of life. So here we have another elements of this figure that, apart from white characteristic, is the guardianship of water source that is commonly known motive, not only in Pamiri folklore, but around the world in general. That could indicate the aquatic nature of the snake. Here we have also the guardianship of Pir Khana. And all that components, let me discuss the last one in a second. So all components are actually well known, but from the other context or from other cultures, like, for example, location of the snake in Pir Khana, which may indicate sacralization of the snake, which remains unclear for me. unclear for me at the very moment in the context of Ismailism. But it is known, like we know snake guardians of the temples from Buddhist tradition, for example. So yeah, so actually all of that components are known, but let's say in different forms. So this is a real hybrid here. Yeah, and let me discuss the last one. That was the interpretation of this legend that one of my informants told me, that there is a metaphorical meaning behind Shahmor Sefid, or looking for Shahmor Sefid is the metaphor for the pursuit of harmonious life, the life that is in line with the path of faith laid down by the Imam. So, analyzing the Shahmor Sefid from this legend, we can trace how heterogeneous elements belonging to different cultural contexts are combined and reused so that they give a new independent meaning. And as I said, each of the components of this figure is actually well known, but here, as a whole, they have a new significance. And actually, and here in that figure, we also deal with cross-cultural borrowings, both from geographically or historically distant cultures. That shows that some imaginaries are very persistent and having the capacity to permeate the diachronic layers of culture. And actually, the most common type of hybrid in my material is one that combines imagery from different stages of cultural development. And this text I also call or perceive as hybrids. Yeah, such hybrids are narratives in which archaic beliefs derived from pre-Islamic religious systems, like hunting and agricultural cults, are reinterpreted using Islamic symbolism, important Islamic figures, etc. Just to mention numerous stories about mountain goat Nakhjir, and one of the legends you can see in the slide. Mountain goat is considered by Pamiris to be the purest and the sacred animal. And this belief and resulting rituals are considered to be a remnant of the mountain goat cult, the cult that is much older than Islam. And already Nikolai Kislyakov in 1930s, in his famous article about Burj, who is a legendary figure found in the stories of the people of Central Asia, he argues that Islam has used an older pre-existing cult of primitive deity identified with a mountain goat, making it into an Islamic saint. And according to the Pamiri legend that you can see in the slide, mountain goats were once owned by the Prophet Abraham. After his death, they went feral, went into the mountains and stayed there. And they never came down again, and now they are grazed and milked by Paris. And according to another variant of this legend, the tending and milking of mountain goats were done by Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, and thus these activities are considered to be noble. So here we can see as different cultural codes are involved in one narrative. So the archaic code of mountain goat is mixed here with figures important in Islamic tradition, and probably that relationship of mountain goat with Abraham and Fatima justified the sanctity of mountain goat. Here we also have like let's say hybrids. Are Paris mentioned here? Yes. So as you can see, according to two different interpretations, mountain goat are linked to Paris or to Fatima, who serve as female carrier of mountain goats. And finally, the last hybrid is connected with the evolution of traditionally Pamiri song, which is called Dildilik or Lalaik. And in the slide, you can see the Dildilik of Abdulmamad Bekmamadov, who is a Pamiri artist living in Moscow. And here is Abdul playing daf and dancing aspak, traditional Pamiri dance. And Abdulmamad, who is quite famous among diaspora in Moscow, draws on traditional forms of Pamiri poetry, but fills them with new content that corresponds to socio-cultural, economic reality of the labor migrants. And he does it in humorous way, as you can see in my translation. His works are often satires. And the Dildilik, which is a sort of lullaby, is a song sung by a mother to her son. It is also often about longing. For example, the lyrical subject is a mother longing to his son who went graze a cattle. It is also often about son growing up and moving away from his mother. And this Dildilik that I would like to play you in a second is not typical Dildilik in terms of structure, because the verses consist of different number of syllables, but they are divided with refrain, which is actually the traditional Dildilik refrain, Dil mu putsik diluma.
I'm sorry,
The verses-
Zuzanna, you have 1 minute.
Okay, so I hope that you read this. Unfortunately, I won't play you this Dildilik. So let me reach to my conclusions. What does research about hybrids can tell us? So this kind of research enables us to grasp the dynamics of folklore. It can help us to understand how flexible and dynamic is folklore and what kind of deviations are acceptable and possible when performing. It also can show us which motifs, themes, or figures are persistent and probably with cultural significance. And finally, analyzing hybrids could show us what factors influence changes within folklore, whether it's migration, as in the case of Dildilik, that could be also a climate change, maybe technological development, access to social media, etc. So generally speaking, focusing on hybrids rather than on a norm could give us an insight into cultural change in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zuzanna, for your very interesting presentation. And now we will have, can you please stop sharing the screen?
Yeah, just a second.
Mm-hmm. And our last presenter in the session is Dr. Azad Haji Aga from Jagiellonian University, who will talk about the relationship between contemporary Iranian intellectuals and Christian theology. Do you want me to share your presentation, Azad? Or
if available, yes, if available.
okay. Just a second. Can you see the screen,
Yes,
the presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's good. Azad, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hello everyone. Before starting, I want to pay my tribute to the memory of the victims of the recent Iranian protesters who lost their lives in the streets. As you know, Iran is a country in the constant flux and filled with the many paradoxes and contradictions. I think this statement is a good point for beginning this presentation because there are intellectuals who stay against modernism while modern, insisting on secularism, and in the meantime emphasizing faith and even Sharia. In today's my presentation, I would like to focus on the part of Iranian religious intellectuals known as post-Islamist intellectuals, especially Abdul Karim Soroush and Mohammad Mojtahid Shabestari. Their efforts is important because, in my opinion, this group of Iranian thinkers or intellectuals has a huge contribution to the changing of theocratic basis of Iranian government and trying to establish a kind of democratization in Iran, similar to efforts made for reformation in the West. My argument is that this generation of Iranian intellectuals, inspiring by Western experience and Christian theology, had tried to make a new synthesis between Islam and Christian theology to achieve separation between state and religious institutions. For this presentation, Soroush and Shabestari have been chosen not only because they are recognized as the two leading and prominent Iranian scholar and intellectuals, but also because they have been in many ways at the forefront of progressive religious SAS in Iran and very active in making a dialogue between Muslim Christian communities. And they have all been prolific in their writings and publishing activities. But it should be noted that none of these intellectuals make any claim to expertise in Christian theology. For beginning, I think it's very important we begin with the Gharb Zadegi discourse. It's a very important, it means that Westoxication, this discourse principally came from Ahmad Fardid, inspiring Heideggerian concepts and by Jalal al-Ahmad, this concept will be articulated and politicized and make a basis for a new Iranian ideologic system and regime. As al-Ahmad himself points out, there is a affinity between his ideas and the German Romanticism, and al-Ahmad try to explaining this term, this idea as a returning to an authentic identity. But what is this identity? It's a Islamic identity. As a Persian words, it's a بازگشت به خویشتن خویش, return to roots. Finally, Westoxication or Gharb Zadegi meet the massive successes and become the most popular concept that the oppositional intellectuals and critical public use to show their resentments of the Pahlavi society in Iran during the years led to Iranian Revolution. Ali Shariati is one of another leading and prominent intellectuals. I try to summarize this presentation. Ali Shariati, rejecting Marxism, determined to create a full-fledged Islamic alternative, generously utilizing Marxist categories and concepts, and the politicization of religion as an anti-secular movement is what brings Shariati's work into the camp of غرب‌زدگی discourse or authenticity discourse, return to self, return to roots. His discourse of authenticity reaches obscure metaphysical depths as a total ideology that we can see some aspects of this ideology in today's Iranian political system. But what happened in this period that led to emerging another generation of Islamic intellectuals that we say, and talking about them as a post-Islamist intellectual. Let me, I borrow a few sentences from Charles Kurzman. He argues that Iranian revolution has had the effect of transforming Shia religious seculars into hierarchical institutions with administrative authorities that even many Iranians regularly compare to the church and clergy in Catholic Christianity, just as the Protestant Reformation wanted to resack Christianity from the clergy and the church hierarchy. The call from Islamic Protestantism wanted to liberate Islam and Iranian Muslims from the political and religious cooperation of the Iranian ruling clerics. This new generation of Iranian Islamist intellectuals have been profoundly influenced, inspiring by revolutionary change in the epistemology that have occurred in the West, science, enlightenment, and clashes between intellectuals and church in the West. These Iranian intellectuals are working within a framework of the absolutized view of truth and reality. In other words, historical, intentional, perspectival, partial, interpretive, and dialogical are main elements of these intellectuals, and it's belong of their sometimes this awareness of the relative aspects of human knowledge has come mainly as a result of going back into Islamic theological and mystical traditions, and sometimes it has been a direct result of interacting with Western philosophical and Western theologians such as Spinoza, such as Paul Tillich, such as Gadamer, and contemporary philosophers such as Paul Ricoeur. But what is concrete definition post-Islamist? In this section, again, I borrow one sentence from Farzin Wahdat. Wahdat understand post-Islamism in terms of emergence of modern subjectivity in post-revolutionary Iranian society. In other words, post-Islamism or post-intellectual begins when a critical mass in a Muslim society abandons the life of passivity and acquires a sense of a kind of assertiveness. It's very important. And in this way, post-Islamist intellectuals believe that Muslims have to take into account morality in order to arrive at justified and plausible account of Islamic jurisprudence in the contemporary world. There has been a new stress and freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and human rights. There have also been a variety of strong criticism of clerical rule. Now we can, I have enough time. I briefly pay attention to Soroush, Abdul Karim Soroush. As you know, Abdul Karim Soroush is the most famous Iranian post-intellectual or Iranian theologians. Soroush's first introduction to Christian literature took place when he was studying in London, and he says that when he was elder in 1973-4, for first time become interested in the philosophy of religion. The first book he read in Christian literature to improve his English was Augustine's book. He knew nothing about at that time about Augustine's, and he was impressed with the humility and similarity of Christian mysticism and Islamic mysticism. Soroush, in this, by reading this book, make resemblance between Augustine's confessions and creating certain Islamic prayers like Sahife Sajjadiyeh, which belong the fourth Shiite imams. And so Soroush in a few interviews acknowledges that I have never taken Christian theology very seriously. However, I find the strength of Christian faith in its emphasis and mercy, brotherhood, and love. Thus, Christian theology is the weakness, and Christian ethics is strength of Christian faith. According to him, ethics that have been influenced by Sufism are very close to Christian ethics. Another aspects of thinking Soroush about Christian theology came from the works of Maulana Rumi and Ghazali, because Rumi and his fondness for Christianity, especially Christian ideals of modesty and humility, played a significant role in Soroush's positive view in his writings. And because Soroush mentioned that Ghazali, Ghazali had read the whole Bible and learned from it, and had made remarks linking between Islamic Sufism and Christianity. Yes, I haven't enough time. For mention to Muhammad Moshtahid Shabestari, I would like to begin by these sentences of Shabestari. It's very famous in Iranian religious literature. He said that all these years I have been looking for God with my hands, rise to the sky, but every day I find my hands empty. It says of one existentialist theologian, Iranian intellectual, post-Islamic intellectuals. Due to my limitations, just I want to talking about in 2 or 3 minutes. I want to briefly focus and a kind of relationship between Shabestari and Spinoza. I remember when I was working on my PhD thesis in a few years ago, it was possible to hear Spinoza's voice in some passage of Shabestari's work, but until publishing the theological and political treatise in Persian, he had never talked about Spinoza. As soon as this book was published in Persian, in his accounts and social media, and especially in his website, Shabestari wrote, knowledge of Spinoza's opinion and arguments about religion, philosophy, and theology is a very important and even necessary for thinking of modern religious people in Iran today. Regarding after this reference and publishing another book about Spinoza, I think it's Spirit of Spinoza by Neil Grossman. Shabestari again writes, the God depicted in this book by Grossman is a God that is not only completely acceptable and defensible for contemporary man, but it is also a God that contemporary man, with all his being, and he's looking for him from the depths of all his helplessness, anxiety, and loneliness. The anthropology of this book, which came out from the heart of theology, is very realistic and liberating. This theology and anthropology is a way of salvation. This book should be read not once but several times to get unique game that it's hidden in it. A very summary. I think I haven't enough time. I would like to as a conclusion, this dialogue between Iranian post-intellectuals and Christian theology has made a huge changes in Iranian religious horizons about cosmos, about religion, about God, and it led to pluralism and focusing and human rights and reconceptualizing public good in Iranian public spheres. Thank you so much for your pay attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Azad. Yes, did I stop sharing the presentation? I hope so. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think our session came to an end. So now we'll have a few minutes break and we come back for discussion in the last part, which is roundtable. What time shall we be back, Carolina or Mateusz?
I think in 10 minutes, so 5 minutes to 1, 12:55.
Okay. Okay, thank you once again. Many thanks to all the presenters, and see you in 10 minutes.